She was 26 and nearly penniless, with a mourning brooch pinned inside her collar and 11 pounds folded into a handkerchief in her pocket. No father to speak for her, no husband to shelter her, no invitation waiting anywhere in England. And with that little, she bought Red Clay Ridge, a house so far gone that a duke on horseback laughed at the sight of her signing for it and said it would be a ruin again within a year. But what nobody knew, not the duke, not the solicitor, not the woman herself, was what lay behind the bricked-up scullery wall. Settle in with us, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Claire Shaw was born in the market town of Ashbourne in the year 1834, the only child of a linen draper named Thomas Shaw and his wife Margaret, who had come to the trade from a family of Derbyshire tenant farmers, and who could measure cloth by eye to within a quarter inch. The shop stood on the corner of Church Street and had a bow window of leaded glass, and Claire spent her childhood on a stool behind the counter, folding calico and learning to add columns of pence in her head before she could reach the till without a footstool. Her mother died of a lung fever when Claire was 9, and her father, a quiet man who had always leaned on his wife's steadiness, took to keeping the accounts poorly and the ledgers worse, and by the time Claire was 13, she was writing out his invoices for him and reconciling the daybook on Sunday evenings while he sat by the coal grate and stared at nothing. She did not complain of it. She learned it, the way she learned everything, by watching and repeating and correcting. The mentor who shaped her most was not her father, but her father's cousin, a widow named Hannah Redfern, who kept a small stone house on the edge of town and who took Claire in during the school holidays, and, later, whenever the shop grew too silent to bear. Hannah was 62 when Claire first knew her properly. A tall, spare woman, with hands as brown as saddle leather, and she had worked as housekeeper at a great house in Staffordshire for 31 years before her husband's death brought her home. Hannah knew how to lay a brick, how to render a wall in lime and horsehair, how to bleed a chimney, how to graft an apple, how to dry hyssop and horehound in the rafters against the winter cough. She taught Claire all of it, not by lecture, but by handing her a trowel or a paring knife and setting her to work beside her. "You've a good eye, girl," Hannah would say, and nothing more. And Claire would carry that sentence for weeks, like a coin in her pocket. Hannah taught her to look at a house the way a doctor looks at a patient, first at the roof, then the drains, then the pointing, then the timbers, then the plaster last of all. Hannah died in the winter of 1854, of pleurisy, and left Claire her copper preserving pan, her stone mortar, her lime-washing brush, and a small brass thimble that had been her own mother's. The thimble scored around its base with a pattern of tiny wheat sheaves, worn nearly smooth on one side from a lifetime of pushing needles through calico and canvas, and once, Hannah had said, through the shroud of a child she had loved. Claire carried the thimble everywhere after that, in a scrap of blue silk in her pocket, and touched it sometimes without meaning to, the way another woman might touch a cross. 2 years after Hannah's death, Thomas Shaw fell down the shop stairs one November evening and did not wake. Claire was 22. The solicitor, a Mr. Peel from Derby, came within the week with a folder of papers and a face arranged for bad news, and explained to her, in the parlor above the shop, that her father had been borrowing steadily against the stock for 11 years, and that the sum owed against the freehold now exceeded the value of everything her father had ever owned. The shop was sold to settle the debt. The bow window and the counter and the brass yardstick, set into the wood, and the stool she had sat on as a child, all went to a linen draper from Buxton, who did not want the fittings and had them broken up for firewood. Claire was left with her clothes, her mother's Bible, Hannah's copper pan and mortar and brush, the brass thimble in its scrap of silk, a small oak writing box her mother had used for household letters, and, when everything was reckoned, £34.06. She took a position as companion housekeeper to a widowed vicar's sister in a village outside Nottingham, and there she stayed for 4 years, keeping the books, ordering the coals, superintending the maid, dosing the pantry mice with plaster of Paris, patching the plaster in the vicar's study where the damp came through, and reading aloud in the evenings from the Cornhill magazine. The wages were £22 a year, and her keep. She saved almost all of it. She wore the same 3 dresses in rotation, and turned the collars herself, and darned the elbows so neatly that the darn could not be found by candlelight. In her 4th year, the vicar's sister died, quite peacefully, of a stroke, and the vicar's married daughter arrived from Lincolnshire to close the house, and informed Claire in the same breath that her services would not be required beyond Michaelmas, and that a black bombazine dress from the deceased's wardrobe was hers if she wanted it, as a token. Claire thanked her, took the dress, packed her trunk, and counted her savings. She had, in total, £117.08, and she was 26 years old, and she had no father, no mother, no cousin, no mistress, no shop, no cottage, no room anywhere in England that was hers by right. What she had, instead, was Hannah's voice in her head saying, "Look first at the roof," and Hannah's thimble in her pocket, and a small advertisement clipped from a Derbyshire paper 3 weeks earlier and folded carefully into her writing box. The advertisement offered, for sale by auction and without reserve, a country house of some antiquity in the parish of Redclay Ridge, described in the copy as being in need of repair. She did not argue, and she did not cry. She had learned in the shop that arguments with people who held the paper never went anywhere useful, and she had learned in Hannah's kitchen that tears wasted salt. She went upstairs to the narrow room over the scullery that had been hers for 4 years, and she sat on the edge of the iron bedstead with her hands folded, and she let herself think for the length of 1/4 chime from the church clock across the lane. Then she stood up and began to pack. She folded the 3 dresses first, the grey wool and the brown stuff gown, and the plain black she wore on Sundays, and she laid the bombazine on top, because the vicar's daughter would come up presently to see if it had been accepted properly. She wrapped the copper preserving pan in a piece of sacking she had saved from the coal delivery, and she wound the lime-washing brush in a strip of old flannel to keep the bristles from bending, and she laid the stone mortar into the bottom of the trunk against the hinges where nothing could shift it. She placed her mother's Bible and the small oak writing box on top of the linen, and she tucked the brass thimble, in its scrap of blue silk, into the inside pocket of her working dress, where it would ride against her hip. The vicar himself came to the door as she was fastening the trunk straps, and he stood in the passage with his hat in his hand and told her, quietly, that his daughter meant no unkindness and that he was very sorry, and Claire said she understood, because she did understand, and there was nothing further to be said between them. He pressed 2 sovereigns into her palm at the door, and she thanked him, and she added them without comment to the handkerchief of coins in the pocket that also carried the thimble. The carter came at 7 the next morning to take her to the coaching inn at Nottingham. She sat beside him on the box with the trunk roped behind and her carpet bag across her knees, and she watched the vicarage recede along the lane in a grey Michaelmas mist, the ivy on the gable, and the low wall with its lichen, and the yew by the gate, and she did not look back a second time. At Nottingham, she paid 4 shillings and 9 for an outside seat on the coach to Derby, and she ate a slice of bread and cheese from a paper on her lap while she waited, and she opened the writing box on the bench beside her, and read the advertisement through once more, slowly, the way Hannah had taught her to read a bill of sale, letter by letter, looking for what was not there. "In need of repair," the copy said, and offered without reserve, and she folded it again along the same creases and put it back in the box, and she pressed the lid down until the little brass hasp clicked. She had £119 and 8 shillings after the vicar's 2 sovereigns, and she had the address of a Derby solicitor named Mr. Ainsley, who was handling the sale, and she had the name of an inn at the village of Red Clay Ridge called the Blue Bell, where she meant to ask for a bed while she looked the property over. She had no letter of introduction to anyone in the county, and no one who expected her arrival. She sat very straight on the bench with the carpet bag on her lap and the writing box tucked under her arm, and when the guard called the coach, she rose and climbed up to the outside seat and settled herself among the parcels, and she pulled the black bombazine shawl she had made from a torn hem of the dead woman's dress up under her chin against the damp. The coach went north through the flat lands out of Nottingham, and then west into the beginnings of the Peak, and Claire watched the country change from her seat on the roof with the attention she had once given to bolts of cloth on the counter. She noted the hedges first, whether they were laid tight or grown ragged, and she noted the sheep in the fields, whether they were sound or scabbed, and she noted the state of the field gates and the stone walls and the roofs of the farm cottages as the coach passed them. A slate slipped on a byre near Belper told her the farmer was behind on his repairs, and a fresh course of pointing on a chimney at Duffield told her another was ahead of his, and she read the landscape this way for hour after hour as the horses climbed and the wind grew colder off the moor. It rained a little between Derby and Ashbourne, a fine grey rain that soaked into the shawl without seeming to fall, and she pulled her bonnet forward and set her boots against the footboard and did not complain, because complaining on a coach roof only made the wind find new places to enter. At Derby, she stepped down long enough to call at the offices of Mr. Ainsley, in a narrow lane behind the Corn Exchange, and she was received by a clerk with ink on his cuff, who consulted a book and told her that the auction was fixed for Thursday next at 11 o'clock, to be held on the premises, and that the reserve was nil, and that the vendor was the estate of a Mr. Whitmore lately deceased, whose heirs had declined the property. She thanked the clerk, took a copy of the particulars in her hand, and returned to the coach with the paper folded inside her glove. The last stage of the journey was the worst, a slow grind up through steep lanes where the coach lamps had to be lit before 4 o'clock, and where the coachman got down twice to lead the horses through mud that came over the boot. She reached the Blue Bell at Red Clay Ridge a little after 7 in the evening, in a dark that smelled of coal smoke and wet bracken, and she took a room at 8d, and she asked the landlady, a broad woman named Mrs. Bickerton, with a wooden spoon in her apron, for a mug of hot ale and a plate of whatever was on the fire. She ate her supper at a corner bench, while the drovers talked at the other end of the room, and she listened to them without seeming to listen, because Hannah had taught her that the best account of a house came not from the auctioneer, but from the men who watered their horses within sight of it. She heard the words the old Whitmore place spoken twice, and she heard someone laugh, and she heard someone else say, "Only a fool would take it." She finished her ale, and went up to her narrow bed under the eaves, and she slept, in her clothes, with the thimble in her hand. On Thursday morning, she walked out to the property at 9:30, in a fine damp mist, along a lane bordered by hazel and blackthorn, and by walls of the local red sandstone that gave the parish its name. The house stood at the end of a rutted drive, 1/2 mile long, set on a shoulder of ground above a stream, with a stand of neglected limes on the north side and a rookery in the tallest of them. She stopped at the broken iron gate and looked, and she looked in the order Hannah had taught her, the roof first. The roof was Welsh slate, and near a third of it was gone, and where the slate was gone, the lead flashings had been robbed from the valleys and the chimneys. Of the 6 chimneys, 4 stood, 1 leaned, and 1 had come down through the ceiling of the room beneath, taking a portion of the floor with it. The house itself was of 2 stories and an attic, built in local sandstone, with quoins of a paler gritstone, and it measured, by her pacing, some 84 feet along the front and 40 deep, with a service wing running back another 30 feet at the west end. The windows were sashes of 12 panes over 12, and of these she counted 42, of which perhaps a dozen still had all their glass, and of which several had been boarded roughly, with elm planks nailed straight through the frames. She walked round to the south front. Ivy had come in under the eaves, and had lifted a section of guttering clean away, so that a green stain ran down the stone for 2 stories. The rendering on the service wing had blown off in patches, and showed lime plaster over rubble beneath. The drains, when she stooped to look, were choked with leaves and the stumps of nettles, and the stream at the foot of the garden had eaten into the bank, and was carrying red silt. Inside, the auctioneer's man had opened the shutters in the hall, and lit a single lantern on the floor. There were perhaps a dozen men present, farmers, and 1 or 2 in better coats, and there was a gentleman on horseback outside who did not dismount. The hall was a stone-flagged room of fine proportion, 28 feet by 20, with a plaster ceiling on which a wreath of oak leaves ran round the border, still intact, but darkened by damp. The oak staircase rose in 3 flights with turned balusters, of which some 15 were missing, and the treads were sound where she trod on them, and the newel post was carved with a pineapple, and had a split-down one face that could be glued and cramped. The bidding began at £5 and rose in ones. The farmers dropped out at 8. A man in a good coat took it to 15. Claire raised her gloved hand and said, £11, meaning she would go to 11 and no further, and the auctioneer, mishearing or humoring her, took it as an advance. The man in the good coat looked at her turned collar and her plain black bombazine, and shook his head and walked away. The auctioneer struck the desk with his little hammer. She paid in 11 sovereigns, counted out from a handkerchief onto the top of a packing case, and she signed the paper with a steady hand. Outside, the gentleman on horseback laughed once, aloud, and said to no one in particular that it would be a ruin again within a year, and rode off down the drive at a walk. Mr. Ainsley's clerk gave her the keys, 4 great iron keys, on a ring of tarred string, and the deeds in a leather wallet tied with tape. She stayed that first night at the Blue Bell, and went out to the house at first light, with a lantern, a broom, a bucket, and a loaf, and she began where Hannah would have begun, which was not with the roof at all, but with the scullery, because a woman who cannot boil water cannot mend a house. The scullery was at the back of the service wing, a low room 15 feet by 12, with a stone-flagged floor sloping to a drain, a copper set into brickwork in one corner, a shallow slate sink under the window, and a wide chimney breast against the outer wall in which no fire had been laid for a long time. It was the chimney breast that stopped her. She stood in the doorway with the lantern raised, and she looked at the wall, and she saw what any careful eye would have seen, which was that the brickwork of the breast did not match the brickwork of the room. The room was built in a soft red brick of the local kilns, laid in lime mortar the color of oatmeal, with the bond a regular Flemish. The chimney breast, from the floor to a height of about 5 feet, had been closed across its front by a panel of harder yellow brick laid in a stretcher bond, in a mortar that was grayer and finer. The fireplace opening, which ought to have been there, had been bricked up, and had been bricked up not long enough ago that the wall had settled fully into the room, because the join at the sides showed a hairline crack that a sixpence would have entered. She set the lantern on the sink, and she fetched from her carpet bag a short iron poker she had brought from the vicarage kitchen, and she tapped along the yellow brick from one side to the other. It rang hollow for the middle 3 feet of its width. She tapped again, higher, and heard the same. She stood back and considered. And she thought of Hannah saying that a house closes up what it does not want strangers to find. And she took the poker and set the point into the mortar at the top of the panel, and worked it back and forth until the first brick loosened. It took her the best part of an hour, kneeling and standing by turn, to lift out enough of the yellow brick to make a hole she could pass her arm through. The bricks came away almost cleanly, because the mortar was young, and the work had been done in haste. She laid each brick on the flagged floor, in the order she had drawn it out, because Hannah had also taught her that a wall pulled down carelessly is a wall that cannot be built again. When the hole was wide enough, she took up the lantern and put it through, and she looked. Inside the chimney breast, on the old hearthstone, stood a black japanned tin box about the size of a family Bible, and beside it, a stoneware jar with a wax-sealed lid, and behind them, propped against the sooty back of the flue, a folded oilcloth packet tied with red tape. She reached in and lifted out the tin box first, because it was nearest, and she carried it to the scullery table and set it down and wiped the soot from its lid with her apron, and she saw that a name had been painted on the top, in white letters now yellowed, J. Whitmore, his box. The box was not locked. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a square of green baize, lay a linen bag heavy in her hand. And when she loosened the drawstring, sovereigns and half-sovereigns spilled onto the baize, in a small, bright heap that made her sit down suddenly on the scullery stool. She counted them where she sat, because Hannah had also taught her that a sum uncounted is a sum unbelieved, and she counted 243 sovereigns and 11 half-sovereigns and a small twist of paper containing 7 guineas of an older coinage. Beneath the linen bag lay a folded paper sealed with a wafer of red wax, addressed in a careful clerkly hand, to whomsoever finds this and has need of it. She broke the wafer with her thumbnail and unfolded the paper on her lap. The hand was small and careful, the ink browned but not faded, and she read it aloud in the empty scullery, because Hannah had taught her that a letter spoken is a letter better understood. To whomsoever finds this and has need of it. My name is Joseph Whitmore. I was schoolmaster at the parish school of Red Clay Ridge for 39 years, and I lived in this house, which came to me from my father, for 41. My wife Anne died in the winter of 1831, and our daughter Mary in the spring following, when she was 6 years old. I had no other children, and no near kin, and the house grew too large for me, and the roof beyond my mending. I have set by, in small sums over many years, what money I could, and I have hidden it here, behind this wall, because I could not bear that it should go to the county, or to the man who holds the mortgage upon the north field. If you are reading this, then you have come into the house honestly, and you have troubled to look where others did not. Take what is here and use it well. Mend the roof first. There is good stone in the ridge above the beck, if you know where to cut it. I hope you will be happier here than I was at the end. Joseph Whitmore, the 14th of October, 1849. She folded the letter along its old creases, and sat for a long while, with it flat on her knee, and the scullery was quiet, except for the small tick of the copper cooling in the corner, and the sound of a rook somewhere out among the neglected limes. Then she wrapped the sovereigns in the green baize again, tied the letter into the oilcloth packet with the deeds, and put the whole into her carpet bag. She stood up, took Hannah's lime-washing brush from the trunk in the hall, and walked out to the front of the house to look at the roof. Mend the roof first, the letter had said, and Hannah had said the same, and she began that afternoon by pacing the ridge from the drive and counting slates. 10 years after that morning, on a bright October afternoon in 1870, Claire Shaw stood at the head of the oak staircase at Red Clay Ridge and watched the light come in through the tall south window on the half landing. She was 36. Her hair was the same brown it had always been, drawn back plainly, and she wore a gray wool dress with a linen collar she had turned that spring. In her pocket, as always, was the brass thimble in its scrap of blue silk, and around her neck, on a fine chain, hung a small brass key that opened the writing box in her sitting room. The staircase beneath her hand had been returned by Samuel Coombs, a joiner of 51 from the village of Ashover, who had cut 15 new balusters from seasoned oak and matched the pineapple newel post so that no eye could tell the split from the sound wood. The plaster wreath of oak leaves on the hall ceiling below her had been washed clean and touched in by Mrs. Ruth Bickerton the younger, the landlady's daughter-in-law, who was 34 and had a steadier hand for lime than any man in the parish. Claire had begun with the roof, as she had been told to begin, and had gone up the ridge above the beck with a mason named Edward Fern, aged 48, who cut sandstone by the old method with a hammer and a set of steel wedges, and who accepted his wages in coin every Saturday evening laid on the kitchen table. In the first year she spent £187 of Joseph Whitmore's savings on slate, lead, timber, lime, and labor, and she wrote every shilling of it into a green cloth-bound book on the writing box her mother had used. In the second year she cleared the drains and rebuilt the fallen chimney, and put glass into 29 windows, and Elizabeth Marsden, a widow of 57 from the lodge cottage, came up each morning to boil the copper and wash the linen of the workmen, and to teach Claire the trick of setting a range so that the coal lasted through the night. In the third year she opened the walled garden on the east side, which had been a thicket of bramble and nettle over her head, and beneath the brambles she found espaliered pears still living against the south wall, and a stone bee-bowl cut into the north wall for 6 skeps. William Ashby, a gardener of 63, who had once worked at Chatsworth in his boyhood, came up on Wednesdays and Saturdays and taught her to prune the pears back to their old fruiting spurs. The house had grown warm around her by slow degrees, room by room, and the community had gathered around the house in the same way, one skill at a time. Thomas Redfern, no kin to Hannah, but a distant echo of the name, brought his cart twice a week from Ashbourne, with lime and sand and iron nails. The vicar of Red Clay Ridge, Mr. Henry Broom, aged 59, called on her within the first month, and afterwards sent his eldest daughter Anne, 17, and quick with a needle, to help stitch the hangings for the 4 beds Claire had put back into use. Mrs. Bickerton at the Blue Bell sent up a joint of mutton every Sunday for 2 years, without being asked, and refused every attempt at payment, beyond a nod at the churchyard gate. When the Duke of the neighboring estate rode past the drive in the 5th year, and saw the new slates catching the sun, and the drive raked, and the limes trimmed of their dead wood, he did not laugh. He touched his hat to the woman standing at the gate, and rode on without a word, and Claire touched her bonnet in return, and went back to her ledger. The house had by then been called, in a Derbyshire paper the previous spring, the finest house in the county, and by an architectural gentleman from London who came down in August to see the plaster, the finest small house in England. Claire had read the notice, folded it, and put it in the writing box beside Joseph Whitmore's letter and the yellowed advertisement she had clipped 10 years before. The 3 papers lay together under the lid, and she opened the box that October afternoon and set the brass thimble in its scrap of blue silk on top of them, and beside the thimble she laid the small painted iron key of Joseph Whitmore's black japanned tin box, which she had kept polished on her writing table since the day she had emptied it. 2 objects from 2 strangers who had both loved a child they had not lived to see grown, and both had left their small, careful savings to a young woman they had never met. Claire went down the staircase and along the flagged passage to the scullery, which was now whitewashed and warm, and had a red geranium on the sill. The chimney breast had been opened again into a proper hearth, and the hearthstone where the tin box had stood was scrubbed pale, and above it, on a plain oak shelf, sat Hannah's copper preserving pan, kept bright with sand and vinegar, and the stone mortar, which was still used every autumn for pounding salt and juniper into the mutton. She stood a moment with her hand on the copper, and thought of Hannah's kitchen in the stone house at the edge of Ashbourne, and of her mother behind the counter in the shop on Church Street, and of Joseph Whitmore sitting at this same scullery table in 1849 with his letter and his wafer of red wax, and she thought that a house was not a thing built once, but a thing kept, and that the keeping was the whole of it. Claire Shaw was 26 and homeless, with no father, no mother, no cousin, no mistress, and no room in England that was hers by right. She had £119 and 8 shillings to her name at the beginning of that autumn, and 11 of those pounds she counted onto a packing case at an auction in a ruined hall, while a duke on horseback laughed at the sight of her and said the house would be a ruin again within a year. It was the best £11 she ever spent. If this story sat well with you, and if you would like to hear more of them told in this quiet, careful way, then settle in and stay close with us on the channel, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight, whether that is a kitchen in a northern town or a room at the end of a long day somewhere far from here, and whether the weather at your window is gray or bright. Share this story with someone who has ever been told that a thing was beyond saving, or that they themselves were. And consider tapping the small bell so that the next story will find you when it is ready. And before you go, sit for a moment with this question, and carry it with you into the rest of your evening if you will. Is there something in your own life, some house or friendship or piece of work or corner of a room, that others have walked past without seeing, and that you know, quietly and without needing to argue the point, is worth the labor of your hands? What would it take to begin with the roof, as Hannah would have said, and to trust that the rest of the house will follow, slate by slate and lime by lime, over the 10 patient years it takes to make a ruin into a home? Tell us, if you feel moved to, and we will read what you write. Until the next story, keep well, and keep your small brass thimbles close to hand.